Chapter I that the general will is indestructible as long as several men in assembly regard themselves as a single body. They have only a single will which is concerned with their common preservation and general well-being. In this case, all the springs of the state are vigorous and simple, and its rules clear and luminous. There are no embroilments or conflicts of interests. The common good is everywhere clearly apparent, and only good sense is needed to perceive it. Peace, unity, and equality are the enemies of political subtlety. Men who are upright and simple are difficult to deceive because of their simplicity. Lures and ingenious pretexts fail to impose upon them, and they are not even subtle enough to be dupes. When, among the happiest people in the world, bands of peasants are seen regulating affairs of state under an oak, and always acting wisely, can we help scorning the ingenious methods of other nations, which make themselves illustrious and wretched with so much art and mystery? A state so governed needs very few laws, and, as it becomes necessary to issue new ones, the necessity is universally seen. The first man to propose them merely says what all have already felt, and there is no question of factions or intrigues or eloquence in order to secure the passage into law of what every one has already decided to do, as soon as he is sure that the rest will act with it. Theorists are led into error because, seeing only states that have been from the beginning wrongly constituted, they are struck by the impossibility of applying such a policy to them. They make great game of all the absurdities a clever rascal or an insinuating speaker might get the people of Paris or London to believe. They do not know that Cromwell would have been put to the bells by the people of Berne, and the Duc de Beaufort on the treadmill by the Genevese. But when the social bond begins to be relaxed and the state to grow weak, when particular interests begin to make themselves felt and the smaller societies to exercise an influence over the larger, the common interest changes and finds opponents. Opinion is no longer unanimous. The general will ceases to be the will of all, contradictory views and debates arise, and the best advice is not taken without question. Finally, when the state, on the eve of ruin, maintains only a vain, illusory, and formal existence, when in every heart the social bond is broken, and the meanest interest brazenly lays hold of the sacred name of public good, the general will become mute. All men, guided by secret motives, no more give their views as citizens than if the state had never been, and iniquitous decrees directed solely to private interest get passed under the name of law. Does it follow from this that the general will is exterminated or corrupt? Not at all. It is always constant, unalterable, and pure, but it is subordinated to other wills which encroach upon its sphere. Each man, in detaching his interest from the common interest, sees clearly that he cannot entirely separate them, but his share in the public mishaps seems to him negligible beside the exclusive good he aims at making his own. Apart from this particular good, he wills the general good in his own interest as strongly as anyone else. Even in selling his vote for money, he does not extinguish in himself the general will, but only eludes it. The fault he commits is that of changing the state of the question and answering something different from what he is asked. Instead of saying by his vote, "It is to the advantage of the state," he says, "It is of advantage to this or that man or party that this or that view should prevail." Thus the law of public order in assemblies is not so much to maintain in them the general will as to secure that the question be always put to it, and the answer always given by it. I could here set down many reflections on the simple right of voting in every act of sovereignty, a right which no one can take from the citizens, and also on the right of stating views, making proposals, dividing and discussing, which the government is always most careful to leave solely to its members. But this important subject would need a treatise to itself, and it is impossible to say everything in a single work. Chapter II Voting. It may be seen, from the last chapter, that the way in which general business is managed may give a clear enough indication of the actual state of morals and the health of the body politic. The more concert reigns in the assemblies, that is, the nearer opinion approaches unanimity, the greater is the dominance of the general will. On the other hand, long debates, dissensions, and tumult proclaim the ascendancy of particular interests and the decline of the state. This seems less clear when two or more orders enter into the constitution, as patricians and plebeians did at Rome, for quarrels between these two orders often disturbed the comitia, even in the best days of the Republic. But the exception is rather apparent than real, for then, through the defect that is inherent in the body politic, there were, so to speak, two states in one, and what is not true of the two together is true of either separately. Indeed, even in the most stormy times, the plebiscita of the people, when the Senate did not interfere with them, always went through quietly and by large majorities. The citizens having but one interest, the people had but a single will. At the other extremity of the circle, unanimity recurs. This is the case when the citizens, having fallen into servitude, have lost both liberty and will. Fear and flattery then change votes into acclamation, deliberation ceases, and only worship or malediction is left. Such was the vile manner in which the Senate expressed its views under the emperor. It did so sometimes with absurd precaution. Tacitus observes that under Otho, the senators, while they heaped curses on Vitellius, contrived at the same time to make a deafening noise, in order that, should he ever become their master, he might not know what each of them had said. On these various considerations depend the rules by which the methods of counting votes and comparing opinions should be regulated, according as the general will is more or less easy to discover, and the state more or less in its decline. There is but one law which, from its nature, needs unanimous consent. This is the social compact, for civil association is the most voluntary of all acts. Every man being born free and his own master, no one, under any pretext whatsoever, can make any man subject without his consent. To decide that the son of a slave is born, a slave is to decide that he is not born a man. If then there are opponents when the social compact is made, their opposition does not invalidate the contract, but merely prevents them from being included in it. They are foreigners among citizens. When the state is instituted, residence constitutes consent. To dwell within its territory is to submit to the sovereign. Apart from this primitive contract, the vote of the majority always binds all the rest. This follows from the contract itself. But it is asked how a man can be both free and forced to conform to wills that are not his own. How are the opponents at once free and subject to laws they have not agreed to? I retort that the question is wrongly put. The citizen gives his consent to all the laws, including those which are passed in spite of his opposition, and even those which punish him when he dares to break any of them. The constant will of all the members of the state is the general will. By virtue of it they are citizens and free. When in the popular assembly a law is proposed, what the people is asked is not exactly whether it approves or rejects the proposal, but whether it is in conformity with the general will, which is their will. Each man, in giving his vote, states his opinion on that point, and the general will is found by counting votes. When therefore the opinion that is contrary to my own prevails, this proves neither more nor less than that I was mistaken, and that what I thought to be the general will was not so. If my particular opinion had carried the day, I should have achieved the opposite of what was my will, and it is in that case that I should not have been free. This presupposes, indeed, that all the qualities of the general will still reside in the majority. When they cease to do so, whatever side a man may take, liberty is no longer possible. In my earlier demonstration of how particular wills are substituted for the general will in public deliberation, I have adequately pointed out the practicable methods of avoiding this abuse, and I shall have more to say of them later on. I have also given the principles for determining the proportional number of votes for declaring that will. A difference of one vote destroys equality. A single opponent destroys unanimity. But between equality and unanimity, there are several grades of unequal division, at each of which this proportion may be fixed in accordance with the condition and the needs of the body politic. There are two general rules that may serve to regulate this relation. First, the more grave and important the questions discussed, the nearer should the opinion that is to prevail approach unanimity. Secondly, the more the matter in hand calls for speed, the smaller the prescribed difference in the numbers of votes may be allowed to become. Where an instant decision has to be reached, a majority of one vote should be enough. The first of these two rules seems more in harmony with the laws, and the second with practical affairs. In any case, it is the combination of them that gives the best proportions for determining the majority necessary. Chapter III Elections. In the elections of the prince and the magistrates, which are, as I have said, complex acts, there are two possible methods of procedure, choice and lot. Both have been employed in various republics, and a highly complicated mixture of the two still survives in the election of the Doge at Venice. Election by lot, says Montesquieu, is democratic in nature. I agree that it is so, but in what sense? The lot, he goes on, is a way of making choice that is unfair to nobody. It leaves each citizen a reasonable hope of serving his country. These are not reasons. If we bear in mind that the election of rulers is a function of government, and not of sovereignty, we shall see why the lot is the method more natural to democracy, in which the administration is better in proportion as the number of its acts is small. In every real democracy, magistracy is not an advantage, but a burdensome charge which cannot justly be imposed on one individual rather than another. The law alone can lay the charge on him on whom the lot falls. For the conditions being then the same for all, and the choice not depending on any human will, there is no particular application to alter the universality of the law. In an aristocracy, the prince chooses the prince, the government is preserved by itself, and voting is rightly ordered. The instance of the election of the Doge of Venice confirms, instead of destroying this distinction, the mixed form suits a mixed government. For it is an error to take the government of Venice for a real aristocracy. If the people has no share in the government, the nobility is itself the people. A host of poor Barnabotes never gets near any magistracy, and its nobility consists merely in the empty title of excellency, and in the right to sit in the Great Council. As this Great Council is as numerous as our General Council at Geneva, its illustrious members have no more privileges than our plain citizen. It is indisputable that, apart from the extreme disparity between the two republics, the bourgeoisie of Geneva is exactly equivalent to the patriciate of Venice. Our natives and inhabitants correspond to the townsmen and the people of Venice. Our peasants correspond to the subjects on the mainland. And however that republic be regarded, if its size be left out of account, its government is no more aristocratic than our own. The whole difference is that, having no life ruler, we do not, like Venice, need to use the lot. Election by lot would have few disadvantages in a real democracy, in which, as equality would everywhere exist in morals and talents as well as in principles and fortunes, it would become almost a matter of indifference who was chosen. But I have already said that a real democracy is only an ideal. When choice and lot are combined, positions that require special talents such as military posts should be filled by the former. The latter does for cases, such as judicial offices, in which good sense, justice, and integrity are enough, because in a state that is well constituted, these qualities are common to all the citizens. Neither lot nor vote has any place in monarchical government. The monarch being by right sole prince and only magistrate, the choice of his lieutenants belongs to none but him. When the Abbé de Saint-Pierre proposed that the councils of the King of France should be multiplied, and their members elected by ballot, he did not see that he was proposing to change the form of government. I should now speak of the methods of giving and counting opinions in the assembly of the people, but perhaps an account of this aspect of the Roman constitution will more forcibly illustrate all the rules I could lay down. It is worth the while of a judicious reader to follow in some detail the working of public and private affairs in a council consisting of 200,000 men. Chapter IV. The Roman Comitia. We are without well-certified records of the first period of Rome's existence. It even appears very probable that most of the stories told about it are fables. Indeed, generally speaking, the most instructive part of the history of peoples, that which deals with their foundation, is what we have least of. Experience teaches us every day what causes lead to the revolutions of empires, but, as no new peoples are now formed, we have almost nothing beyond conjecture to go upon in explaining how they were created. The customs we find established show at least that these customs had an origin. The traditions that go back to those origins, that have the greatest authorities behind them, and that are confirmed by the strongest proofs, should pass for the most certain. These are the rules I have tried to follow in inquiring how the freest and most powerful people on earth exercised its supreme power. After the foundation of Rome, the newborn republic, that is, the army of its founder, composed of Albans, Sabines, and foreigners, was divided into three classes, which from this division took the name of tribes. Each of these tribes was subdivided into 10 curiae, and each curia into decuriae, headed by leaders called curians and decurions. Besides this, out of each tribe was taken a body of 100 equites or knights, called a century, which shows that these divisions, being unnecessary in a town, were at first merely military. But an instinct for greatness seems to have led the little township of Rome to provide itself in advance with a political system suitable for the capital of the world. Out of this original division, an awkward situation soon arose. The tribes of the Albans, Ramnenses, and the Sabines, Tascenses, remained always in the same condition, while that of the foreigners, Luceres, continually grew as more and more foreigners came to live at Rome, so that it soon surpassed the others in strength. Servius remedied this dangerous fault by changing the principle of cleavage, and substituting for the racial division, which he abolished, a new one based on the quarter of the town inhabited by each tribe. Instead of 3 tribes, he created 4, each occupying and named after one of the hills of Rome. Thus, while redressing the inequality of the moment, he also provided for the future, and in order that the division might be one of persons as well as localities, he forbade the inhabitants of one quarter to migrate to another, and so prevented the mingling of the races. He also doubled the 3 old centuries of knights and added 12 more, still keeping the old names, and by this simple and prudent method, succeeded in making a distinction between the body of knights and the people, without a murmur from the latter. The 4 urban tribes Servius added 15 others called rural tribes, because they consisted of those who lived in the country, divided into 15 cantons. Subsequently, 15 more were created, and the Roman people finally found itself divided into 35 tribes, as it remained down to the end of the Republic. The distinction between urban and rural tribes had one effect which is worth mention, both because it is without parallel elsewhere, and because to it Rome owed the preservation of her morality and the enlargement of her empire. We should have expected that the urban tribes would soon monopolize power and honors, and lose no time in bringing the rural tribes into disrepute, but what happened was exactly the reverse. The taste of the early Romans for country life is well known. This taste they owed to their wise founder, who made rural and military labors go along with liberty, and so to speak, relegated to the town arts, crafts, intrigue, fortune, and slavery. Since therefore all Rome's most illustrious citizens lived in the fields and tilled the earth, men grew used to seeking there alone the mainstays of the Republic. This condition, being that of the best patricians, was honored by all men. The simple and laborious life of the villager was preferred to the slothful and idle life of the bourgeoisie of Rome, and he who, in the town, would have been but a wretched proletarian, became, as a laborer in the fields, a respected citizen. Not without reason, says Varro, did our great-souled ancestors establish in the village the nursery of the sturdy and valiant men who defended them in time of war, and provided for their sustenance in time of peace. Pliny states positively that the country tribes were honored because of the men of whom they were composed, while cowards men wished to dishonor were transferred, as a public disgrace, to the town tribes. The Sabine Appius Claudius, when he had come to settle in Rome, was loaded with honors and enrolled in a rural tribe, which subsequently took his family name. Lastly, freedmen always entered the urban, and never the rural tribes, nor is there a single example, throughout the Republic, of a freedman, though he had become a citizen, reaching any magistracy. This was an excellent rule, but it was carried so far that in the end it led to a change, and certainly to an abuse in the political system. First, the censors, after having for a long time claimed the right of transferring citizens arbitrarily from one tribe to another, allowed most persons to enroll themselves in whatever tribe they pleased. This permission certainly did no good, and further robbed the censorship of one of its greatest resources. Moreover, as the great and powerful all got themselves enrolled in the country tribes, while the freedmen who had become citizens remained with the populace in the town tribes, both soon ceased to have any local or territorial meaning, and all were so confused that the members of one could not be told from those of another, except by the registers, so that the idea of the word tribe became personal instead of real, or rather came to be little more than a chimera. It happened in addition that the town tribes, being more on the spot, were often the stronger in the comitia, and sold the state to those who stooped to buy the votes of the rabble composing them. As the founder had set up 10 curiae in each tribe, the whole Roman people, which was then contained within the walls, consisted of 30 curia, each with its temples, its gods, its officers, its priests, and its festivals, which were called compitalia and corresponded to the paganalia, held in later times by the rural tribes. When Servius made his new division, as the 30 curiae could not be shared equally between his 4 tribes, and as he was unwilling to interfere with them, they became a further division of the inhabitants of Rome, quite independent of the tribes. But in the case of the rural tribes and their members, there was no question of curiae, as the tribes had then become a purely civil institution, and a new system of levying troops having been introduced. The military divisions of Romulus were superfluous. Thus, although every citizen was enrolled in a tribe, there were very many who were not members of a curia. Servius made yet a third division, quite distinct from the 2 we have mentioned, which became, in its effects, the most important of all. He distributed the whole Roman people into 6 classes, distinguished neither by place nor by person, but by wealth. The first classes included the rich, the last the poor, and those between persons of moderate means. These 6 classes were subdivided into 193 other bodies, called centuries, which were so divided that the first class alone comprised more than half of them, while the last comprised only one. Thus the class that had the smallest number of members had the largest number of centuries, and the whole of the last class only counted as a single subdivision, although it alone included more than half the inhabitants of Rome. In order that the people might have the less insight into the results of this arrangement, Servius tried to give it a military tone. In the second class, he inserted 2 centuries of armorers, and in the fourth 2 of makers of instruments of war, in each class except the last. He distinguished young and old, that is, those who were under an obligation to bear arms and those whose age gave them legal exemption. It was this distinction, rather than that of wealth, which required frequent repetition of the census or counting. Lastly, he ordered that the assembly should be held in the Campus Martius, and that all who were of age to serve should come there armed. The reason for his not making in the last class also the division of young and old was that the populace, of whom it was composed, was not given the right to bear arms for its country. A man had to possess a hearth to acquire the right to defend it, and of all the troops of beggars who today lend luster to the armies of kings, there is perhaps not one who would not have been driven with scorn out of a Roman cohort, at a time when soldiers were the defenders of liberty. In this last class, however, proletarians were distinguished from capite censi. The former, not quite reduced to nothing, at least gave the state citizens, and sometimes, when the need was pressing, even soldiers. Those who had nothing at all, and could be numbered only by counting heads, were regarded as of absolutely no account, and Marius was the first who stooped to enroll them. Without deciding now whether this third arrangement was good or bad in itself, I think I may assert that it could have been made practicable only by the simple morals, the disinterestedness, the liking for agriculture and the scorn for commerce and for love of gain which characterized the early Roman. Where is the modern people among whom consuming greed, unrest, intrigue, continual removals, and perpetual changes of fortune could let such a system last for 20 years without turning the state upside down? We must indeed observe that morality and the censorship, being stronger than this institution, corrected its defects at Rome, and that the rich man found himself degraded to the class of the poor for making too much display of his riches. From all this it is easy to understand why only 5 classes are almost always mentioned, though there were really 6. The 6th, as it furnished neither soldiers to the army nor votes in the Campus Martius, and was almost without function in the state, was seldom regarded as of any account. These were the various ways in which the Roman people was divided. Let us now see the effect on the assembly. When lawfully summoned, these were called comitia. They were usually held in the public square at Rome or in the Campus Martius, and were distinguished as comitia curiata, comitia centuriata, and comitia tributa, according to the form under which they were convoked. The comitia curiata were founded by Romulus, the centuriata by Servius, and the tributa by the tribunes of the people. No law received its sanction, and no magistrate was elected, save in the comitia, and as every citizen was enrolled in a curia, a century, or a tribe, it follows that no citizen was excluded from the right of voting, and that the Roman people was truly sovereign both de jure and de facto. For the comitia to be lawfully assembled, and for their acts to have the force of law, 3 conditions were necessary. First, the body or magistrate convoking them had to possess the necessary authority. Secondly, the assembly had to be held on a day allowed by law. And thirdly, the auguries had to be favorable. The reason for the first regulation needs no explanation. The second is a matter of policy. Thus, the comitia might not be held on festivals or market days, when the country folk, coming to Rome on business, had not time to spend the day in the public square. By means of the third, the Senate held in check the proud and restive people, and meetly restrained the ardor of seditious tribunes, who, however, found more than one way of escaping this hindrance. Laws and the election of rulers were not the only questions submitted to the judgment of the comitia. As the Roman people had taken on itself the most important functions of government, it may be said that the lot of Europe was regulated in its assembly. The variety of their objects gave rise to the various forms these took, according to the matters on which they had to pronounce. In order to judge of these various forms, it is enough to compare them. Romulus, when he set up curiae, had in view the checking of the Senate by the people, and of the people by the Senate, while maintaining his ascendancy over both alike. He therefore gave the people, by means of this assembly, all the authority of numbers to balance that of power and riches, which he left to the patricians. But after the spirit of monarchy, he left all the same a greater advantage to the patricians in the influence of their clients on the majority of votes. This excellent institution of patron and client was a masterpiece of statesmanship and humanity, without which the patriciate, being flagrantly in contradiction to the republican spirit, could not have survived. Rome alone has the honor of having given to the world this great example, which never led to any abuse, and yet has never been followed. As the assemblies by curii persisted under the kings till the time of Servius, and the reign of the later Tarquin was not regarded as legitimate, royal laws were called generally leges curiae. Under the Republic, the curii still confined to the 4 urban tribes, and including only the populace of Rome, suited neither the Senate, which led the patricians, nor the tribunes, who, though plebeians, were at the head of the well-to-do citizens. They therefore fell into disrepute, and their degradation was such that 30 lictors used to assemble and do what the comitia curiata should have done. The division by centuries was so favorable to the aristocracy that it is hard to see at first how the Senate ever failed to carry the day in the comitia bearing their name, by which the consuls, the censors, and the other curule magistrates were elected. Indeed, of the 193 centuries into which the 6 classes of the whole Roman people were divided, the first class contained 98, and, as voting went solely by centuries, this class alone had a majority over all the rest. When all these centuries were in agreement, the rest of the votes were not even taken. The decision of the smallest number passed for that of the multitude, and it may be said that, in the comitia centuriata, decisions were regulated far more by depth of purses than by the number of votes. But this extreme authority was modified in 2 ways. First, the tribunes as a rule, and always a great number of plebeians, belonged to the class of the rich, and so counterbalanced the influence of the patricians in the first class. The second way was this. Instead of causing the centuries to vote throughout in order, which would have meant beginning always with the first, the Romans always chose one by lot which proceeded alone to the election. After this, all the centuries were summoned another day according to their rank, and the same election was repeated, and as a rule confirmed. Thus the authority of example was taken away from rank, and given to the lot on a democratic principle. From this custom resulted a further advantage. Citizens from the country had time, between the 2 elections, to inform themselves of the merits of the candidate who had been provisionally nominated, and did not have to vote without knowledge of the case. But under the pretext of hastening matters, the abolition of this custom was achieved, and both elections were held on the same day. The comitia tributa were properly the council of the Roman people. They were convoked by the tribunes alone. At them the tribunes were elected and passed their plebiscita. The Senate not only had no standing in them, but even no right to be present, and the senators, being forced to obey laws on which they could not vote, were in this respect less free than the meanest citizen. This injustice was altogether ill-conceived, and was alone enough to invalidate the decrees of a body to which all its members were not admitted. Had all the patricians attended the comitia by virtue of the right they had as citizens, they would not, as mere private individuals, have had any considerable influence on a vote reckoned by counting heads, where the meanest proletarian was as good as the princeps senatus. It may be seen, therefore, that besides the order which was achieved by these various ways of distributing so great a people and taking its votes, the various methods were not reducible to forms indifferent in themselves, but the results of each were relative to the objects which caused it to be preferred. Without going here into further details, we may gather from what has been said above that the comitia tributa were the most favorable to popular government, and the comitia centuriata to aristocracy. The comitia curiata, in which the populace of Rome formed the majority, being fitted only to further tyranny and evil designs, naturally fell into disrepute, and even seditious persons abstained from using a method which too clearly revealed their projects. It is indisputable that the whole majesty of the Roman people lay solely in the comitia centuriata, which alone included all, for the comitia curiata excluded the rural tribes, and the comitia tributa the Senate and the patrician. As for the method of taking the vote, it was among the ancient Romans as simple as their morals, although not so simple as at Sparta. Each man declared his vote aloud, and a clerk duly wrote it down. The majority in each tribe determined the vote of the tribe, the majority of the tribes that of the people, and so with curii and centuries. This custom was good as long as honesty was triumphant among the citizens, and each man was ashamed to vote publicly in favor of an unjust proposal or an unworthy subject. But when the people grew corrupt and votes were bought, it was fitting that voting should be secret in order that purchasers might be restrained by mistrust, and rogues be given the means of not being traitors. I know that Cicero attacks this change, and attributes partly to it the ruin of the Republic. But though I feel the weight Cicero's authority must carry on such a point, I cannot agree with him. I hold, on the contrary, that, for want of enough such changes, the destruction of the state must be hastened. Just as the regimen of health does riot suit the sick, we should not wish to govern a people that has been corrupted by the laws that a good people require. There is no better proof of this rule than the long life of the Republic of Venice, of which the shadow still exists, solely because its laws are suitable only for men who are wicked. The citizens were provided, therefore, with tablets by means of which each man could vote without anyone knowing how he voted. New methods were also introduced for collecting the tablets, for counting voices, for comparing numbers, etc. But all these precautions did not prevent the good faith of the officers charged with these functions from being often suspect. Finally, to prevent intrigues and trafficking in votes, edicts were issued, but their very number proves how useless they were. Towards the close of the Republic, it was often necessary to have recourse to extraordinary expedients in order to supplement the inadequacy of the law. Sometimes miracles were supposed, but this method, while it might impose on the people, could not impose on those who govern. Sometimes an assembly was hastily called together, before the candidates had time to form their factions. Sometimes a whole sitting was occupied with talk, when it was seen that the people had been won over and was on the point of taking up a wrong position. But in the end, ambition eluded all attempts to check it, and the most incredible fact of all is that, in the midst of all these abuses, the vast people, thanks to its ancient regulations, never ceased to elect magistrates, to pass laws, to judge cases, and to carry through business both public and private, almost as easily as the Senate itself could have done. Chapter V. The tribunate, when an exact proportion cannot be established between the constituent parts of the state, or when causes that cannot be removed continually alter the relation of one part to another, recourse is had to the institution of a peculiar magistracy that enters into no corporate unity with the rest. This restores to each term its right relation to the others, and provides a link or middle term between either prince and people, or prince and sovereign, or, if necessary, both at once. This body, which I shall call the tribunate, is the preserver of the laws and of the legislative power. It serves sometimes to protect the sovereign against the government, as the tribunes of the people did at Rome, sometimes to uphold the government against the people, as the Council of Ten now does at Venice, and sometimes to maintain the balance between the two, as the ephors did at Sparta. The tribunate is not a constituent part of the city, and should have no share in either legislative or executive power, but this very fact makes its own power the greater, for, while it can do nothing, it can prevent anything from being done. It is more sacred and more revered, as the defender of the laws, than the prince who executes them, or than the sovereign which ordains them. This was seen very clearly at Rome, when the proud patricians, for all their scorn of the people, were forced to bow before one of its officers, who had neither auspices nor jurisdiction. The tribunate, wisely tempered, is the strongest support a good constitution can have, but if its strength is ever so little excessive, it upsets the whole state. Weakness, on the other hand, is not natural to it, provided it is something, it is never less than it should be. It degenerates into tyranny when it usurps the executive power, which it should confine itself to restraining, and when it tries to dispense with the laws, which it should confine itself to protect. The immense power of the ephors, harmless as long as Sparta preserved its morality, hastened corruption when once it had begun. The blood of Auges, slaughtered by these tyrants, was avenged by his successor. The crime and the punishment of the ephors alike hastened the destruction of the Republic, and after Cleomenes Sparta ceased to be of any account. Rome perished in the same way. The excessive power of the tribunes, which they had usurped by degrees, finally served, with the help of laws made to secure liberty, as a safeguard for the emperors who destroyed it. As for the Venetian Council of Ten, it is a tribunal of blood, an object of horror to patricians and people alike, and so far from giving a lofty protection to the laws, it does nothing, now they have become degraded, but strike in the darkness blows of which no one dare take note. The tribunate, like the government, grows weak as the number of its members increases. When the tribunes of the Roman people, who first numbered only 2 and then 5, wished to double that number, the Senate let them do so, in the confidence that it could use one to check another, as indeed it afterwards freely did. The best method of preventing usurpations by so formidable a body, though no government has yet made use of it, would be not to make it permanent, but to regulate the periods during which it should remain in abeyance. These intervals, which should not be long enough to give abuses time to grow strong, may be so fixed by law that they can easily be shortened at need by extraordinary commission. This method seems to me to have no disadvantages, because, as I have said, the tribunate, which forms no part of the Constitution, can be removed without the Constitution being affected. It seems to be also efficacious, because a newly restored magistrate starts not with the power his predecessor exercised, but with that which the law allows him. Chapter VI. The dictatorship, the inflexibility of the laws, which prevents them from adapting themselves to circumstances, may, in certain cases, render them disastrous, and make them bring about, at a time of crisis, the ruin of the state. The order and slowness of the forms they enjoin require a space of time, which circumstances sometimes withhold. 1,000 cases against which the legislator has made no provision may present themselves, and it is a highly necessary part of foresight to be conscious that everything cannot be foreseen. It is wrong, therefore, to wish to make political institutions so strong as to render it impossible to suspend their operation. Even Sparta allowed its laws to lapse. However, none but the greatest dangers can counterbalance that of changing the public order, and the sacred power of the laws should never be arrested save when the existence of the country is at stake. In these rare and obvious cases, provision is made for the public security by particular act entrusting it to him who is most worthy. This commitment may be carried out in either of two ways, according to the nature of the danger. If increasing the activity of the government is a sufficient remedy, power is concentrated in the hands of one or two of its members. In this case, the change is not in the authority of the laws, but only in the form of administering. If, on the other hand, the peril is of such a kind that the paraphernalia of the laws are an obstacle to their preservation, the method is to nominate a supreme ruler, who shall silence all the laws and suspend for a moment the sovereign authority. In such a case, there is no doubt about the general will, and it is clear that the people's first intention is that the state shall not perish. Thus the suspension of the legislative authority is in no sense its abolition. The magistrate who silences it cannot make it speak. He dominates it, but cannot represent it. He can do anything except make laws. The first method was used by the Roman Senate when, in a consecrated formula, it charged the consuls to provide for the safety of the republic. The second was employed when one of the two consuls nominated a dictator, a custom Rome borrowed from Alba. During the first period of the republic, recourse was very often had to the dictatorship, because the state had not yet a firm enough basis to be able to maintain itself by the strength of its constitution alone. As the state of morality then made superfluous many of the precautions which would have been necessary at other times, there was no fear that a dictator would abuse his authority or try to keep it beyond his term of office. On the contrary, so much power appeared to be burdensome to him who was clothed with it, and he made all speed to lay it down, as if taking the place of the laws had been too troublesome and too perilous a position to retain. It is therefore the danger not of its abuse, but of its cheapening, that makes me attack the indiscreet use of this supreme magistracy in the earliest time. For as long as it was freely employed at elections, dedications, and purely formal functions, there was danger of its becoming less formidable in time of need, and of men growing accustomed to regarding as empty a title that was used only on occasions of empty ceremonial. Towards the end of the Republic, the Romans, having grown more circumspect, were as unreasonably sparing in the use of the dictatorship as they had formerly been lavish. It is easy to see that their fears were without foundation, that the weakness of the capital secured it against the magistrates who were in its midst, that a dictator might in certain cases defend the public liberty but could never endanger it, and that the chains of Rome would be forged, not in Rome itself, but in her army. The weak resistance offered by Marius to Sulla, and by Pompey to Caesar, clearly showed what was to be expected from authority at home against force from abroad. This misconception led the Romans to make great mistakes, such, for example, as the failure to nominate a dictator in the Catilinarian conspiracy. For as only the city itself, with at most some province in Italy, was concerned, the unlimited authority the laws gave to the dictator would have enabled him to make short work of the conspiracy, which was, in fact, stifled only by a combination of lucky chances human prudence had no right to expect. Instead, the Senate contented itself with entrusting its whole power to the consuls, so that Cicero, in order to take effective action, was compelled on a capital point to exceed his powers. And if, in the first transports of joy, his conduct was approved, he was justly called, later on, to account for the blood of citizens spilt in violation of the law. Such a reproach could never have been leveled at a dictator. But the consul's eloquence carried the day, and he himself, Roman though he was, loved his own glory better than his country and sought, not so much the most lawful and secure means of saving the state, as to get for himself the whole honor of having done so. He was therefore justly honored as the liberator of Rome, and also justly punished as a lawbreaker. However brilliant his recall may have been, it was undoubtedly an act of pardon. However this important trust be conferred, It is important that its duration should be fixed at a very brief period, incapable of being ever prolonged. In the crises which lead to its adoption, the state is either soon lost or soon saved, and the present need past, the dictatorship becomes either tyrannical or idle. At Rome, where dictators held office for 6 months only, most of them abdicated before their time was up. If their term had been longer, they might well have tried to prolong it still further, as the decemvirs did when chosen for a year. The dictator had only time to provide against the need that had caused him to be chosen. He had none to think of further projects. Chapter VII. The censorship as the law is the declaration of the general will. The censorship is the declaration of the public judgment. Public opinion is the form of law which the censor administers, and like the prince, only applies to particular cases. The censorial tribunal, so far from being the arbiter of the people's opinion, only declares it, and as soon as the two-part company, its decisions are null and void. It is useless to distinguish the morality of a nation from the objects of its esteem. Both depend on the same principle and are necessarily indistinguishable. There is no people on earth the choice of whose pleasures is not decided by opinion rather than nature. Write men's opinions, and their morality will purge itself. Men always love what is good or what they find good. It is in judging what is good that they go wrong. This judgment, therefore, is what must be regulated. He who judges of morality judges of honor, and he who judges of honor finds his law in opinion. The opinions of a people are derived from its constitution. Although the law does not regulate morality, it is legislation that gives it birth. When legislation grows weak, morality degenerates, but in such cases the judgment of the censors will not do what the force of the laws has failed to effect. From this it follows that the censorship may be useful for the preservation of morality, but can never be so for its restoration. Set up censors while the laws are vigorous. As soon as they have lost their vigor, all hope is gone. No legitimate power can retain force when the laws have lost it. The censorship upholds morality by preventing opinion from growing corrupt, by preserving its rectitude by means of wise applications, and sometimes even by fixing it when it is still uncertain. The employment of seconds in duels, which had been carried to wild extremes in the kingdom of France, was done away with merely by these words in a royal edict, as for those who are cowards enough to call upon seconds. This judgment, in anticipating that of the public, suddenly decided it. But when edicts from the same source tried to pronounce dueling itself an act of cowardice, as indeed it is, then, since common opinion does not regard it as such, the public took no notice of a decision on a point on which its mind was already made up. I have stated elsewhere that as public opinion is not subject to any constraint, there need be no trace of it in the tribunal set up to represent it. It is impossible to admire too much the art with which this resource, which we moderns have wholly lost, was employed by the Romans, and still more by the Lacedaemonians. A man of bad morals having made a good proposal in the Spartan council, the ephors neglected it, and caused the same proposal to be made by a virtuous citizen. What an honor for the one, and what a disgrace for the other, without praise or blame of either. Certain drunkards from Samos polluted the tribunal of the ephors. The next day, a public edict gave Samians permission to be filthy. An actual punishment would not have been so severe as such an impunity. When Sparta has pronounced on what is or is not right, Greece makes no appeal from her judgments. Chapter VII. Civil religion. At first men had no kings save the gods, and no government save theocracy. They reason like Caligula, and at that period reason aright. It takes a long time for feeling so to change that men can make up their minds to take their equals as masters, in the hope that they will profit by doing so. From the mere fact that God was set over every political society, it followed that there were as many gods as peoples. Two peoples that were strangers the one to the other, and almost always enemies, could not long recognize the same master. Two armies giving battle could not obey the same leader. National divisions thus led to polytheism, and this in turn gave rise to theological and civil intolerance, which, as we shall see hereafter, are by nature the same. Fancy the Greeks had for rediscovering their gods among the barbarian arose from the way they had of regarding themselves as the natural sovereigns of such people. But there is nothing so absurd as the erudition which in our days identifies and confuses gods of different nations. As if Moloch, Saturn, and Kronos could be the same god. As if the Phoenician Baal, the Greek Zeus, and the Latin Jupiter could be the same. As if there could still be anything common to imaginary beings with different names. If it is asked how in pagan times, where each state had its cult and its gods, there were no wars of religion. I answer that it was precisely because each state, having its own cult as well as its own government, made no distinction between its gods and its law. Political war was also theological. The provinces of the gods were, so to speak, fixed by the boundaries of nation. The god of one people had no right over another. The gods of the pagans were not jealous gods. They shared among themselves the empire of the world. Even Moses and the Hebrews sometimes lent themselves to this view by speaking of the God of Israel. It is true, they regarded as powerless the gods of the Canaanites, a proscribed people condemned to destruction, whose place they were to take, but remember how they spoke of the divisions of the neighboring peoples they were forbidden to attack. Is not the possession of what belongs to your God Chamos lawfully your due? Said Jephthah to the Ammonites. We have the same title to the lands our conquering God has made his own. Here, I think, there is a recognition that the rights of Chamos and those of the God of Israel are of the same nature. But when the Jews, being subject to the kings of Babylon, and subsequently to those of Syria, still obstinately refused to recognize any god save their own, their refusal was regarded as rebellion against their conqueror, and drew down on them the persecutions we read of in their history, which are without parallel till the coming of Christianity. Every religion, therefore, being attached solely to the laws of the state which prescribed it, there was no way of converting a people except by enslaving it, and there could be no missionaries save conquerors. The obligation to change cults being the law to which the vanquished yielded, it was necessary to be victorious before suggesting such a change. So far from men fighting for the gods, as in Homer, fought for men. Each asked his god for victory, and repaid him with new altars. The Romans, before taking a city, summoned its gods to quit it, and in leaving the Tarentines their outraged gods, they regarded them as subject to their own and compelled to do them homage. They left the vanquished their gods as they left them their laws. A wreath to the Jupiter of the capital was often the only tribute they imposed. Finally, when, along with their empire, the Romans had spread their cult and their gods, and had themselves often adopted those of the vanquished, by granting to both alike the rights of the city, the peoples of that vast empire insensibly found themselves with multitudes of gods and cults, everywhere almost the same, and thus paganism throughout the known world finally came to be one and the same religion. It was in these circumstances that Jesus came to set up on earth a spiritual kingdom, which, by separating the theological from the political system, made the state no longer one, and brought about the internal divisions which have never ceased to trouble Christian people. As the new idea of a kingdom of the other world could never have occurred to pagans, they always looked on the Christians as really rebels, who, while feigning to submit, were only waiting for the chance to make themselves independent and their masters, and to usurp by guile the authority they pretended in their weakness to respect. This was the cause of the persecution. What the pagans had feared took place. Then everything changed its aspect. The humble Christians changed their language, and soon this so-called kingdom of the other world turned, under a visible leader, into the most violent of earthly despotism. However, as there have always been a prince and civil laws, this double power and conflict of jurisdiction have made all good polity impossible in Christian states, and men have never succeeded in finding out whether they were bound to obey the master or the priest. Several peoples, however, even in Europe and its neighborhood, have desired without success to preserve or restore the old system, but the spirit of Christianity has everywhere prevailed. The sacred cult has always remained or again become independent of the sovereign, and there has been no necessary link between it and the body of the state. Mahomet held very sane views and linked his political system well together, and as long as the form of his government continued under the caliphs who succeeded him, that government was indeed one, and so far good. But the Arabs, having grown prosperous, lettered, civilized, slack, and cowardly, were conquered by barbarians. The division between the two powers began again, and although it is less apparent among the Mahometans than among the Christians, it nonetheless exists, especially in the sect of Ali, and there are states such as Persia where it is continually making itself felt. Among us, the kings of England have made themselves heads of the church, and the czars have done the same, but this title has made them less its masters than its ministers. They have gained not so much the right to change it, as the power to maintain it. They are not its legislators, but only its princes. Wherever the clergy is a corporate body, it is master and legislator in its own country. There are thus two powers, two sovereigns in England and in Russia, as well as elsewhere. Of all Christian writers, the philosopher Hobbes alone has seen the evil and how to remedy it, and has dared to propose the reunion of the two heads of the eagle, and the restoration throughout of political unity, without which no state or government will ever be rightly constituted. But he should have seen that the masterful spirit of Christianity is incompatible with his system, and that the priestly interest would always be stronger than that of the state. It is not so much what is false and terrible in his political theory, as what is just and true, that has drawn down hatred on. I believe that if the study of history were developed from this point of view, it would be easy to refute the contrary opinions of Bale and Warburton, one of whom holds that religion can be of no use to the body politic, while the other, on the contrary, maintains that Christianity is its strongest support. We should demonstrate to the former that no state has ever been founded without a religious basis, and to the latter, that the law of Christianity at bottom does more harm by weakening than good by strengthening the constitution of the state. To make myself understood, I have only to make a little more exact the two vague ideas of religion as relating to this subject. Religion, considered in relation to society, which is either general or particular, may also be divided into two kinds, the religion of man and that of the citizen. The first, which has neither temples nor altars nor rites, and is confined to the purely internal cult of the supreme God and the eternal obligations of morality, is the religion of the gospel, pure and simple, the true theism, what may be called natural divine right or law. The other, which is codified in a single country, gives it its gods, its own tutelary patrons, it has its dogmas, its rites, and its external cult prescribed by law. Outside the single nation that follows it, all the world is in its sight infidel, foreign and barbarous. The duties and rights of man extend for it only as far as its own altar. This kind were all the religions of early peoples, which we may define as civil or positive divine right or law. There is a third sort of religion of a more singular kind, which gives men two codes of legislation, two rulers and two countries, renders them subject to contradictory duties, and makes it impossible for them to be faithful both to religion and to citizenship. Such are the religions of the Lamas and of the Japanese, and such is Roman Christianity, which may be called the religion of the priest. It leads to a sort of mixed and antisocial code which has no name. In their political aspect, all these three kinds of religion have their defects. The third is so clearly bad that it is waste of time to stop to prove it such. All that destroys social unity is worthless. All institutions that set man in contradiction to himself are worthless. The second is good in that it unites the divine cult with love of the laws, and making country the object of the citizens' adoration, teaches them that service done to the state is service done to its tutelary God. It is a form of theocracy, in which there can be no pontiff save the prince, and no priest save the magistrate. To die for one's country then becomes martyrdom, violation of its laws, impiety, and to subject one who is guilty to public execration is to condemn him to the anger of the gods, sacer esta. On the other hand, it is bad in that, being founded on lies and error, it deceives men, makes them credulous and superstitious, and drowns the true cult of the divinity in empty ceremonial. It is bad, again, when it becomes tyrannous and exclusive, and makes a people bloodthirsty and intolerant, so that it breathes fire and slaughter, and regards as a sacred act the killing of every one who does not believe in its gods. The result is to place such a people in a natural state of war with all others, so that its security is deeply in danger. There remains therefore the religion of man or Christianity, not the Christianity of today, but that of the gospel, which is entirely different. By means of this holy, sublime, and real religion all men, being children of one God, recognize one another as brothers, and the society that unites them is not dissolved even at death. But this religion, having no particular relation to the body politic, leaves the laws in possession of the force they have in themselves without making any addition to it, and thus one of the great bonds that unites society considered in severalty fails to operate. Nay, more, so far from binding the hearts of the citizens to the state, it has the effect of taking them away from all earthly things. I know of nothing more contrary to the social spirit. We are told that a people of true Christians would form the most perfect society imaginable. I see in this supposition only one great difficulty, that a society of true Christians would not be a society of men. I say further that such a society, with all its perfection, would be neither the strongest nor the most lasting. The very fact that it was perfect would rob it of its bond of union. The flaw that would destroy it would lie in its very perfection. Every one would do his duty, the people would be law-abiding, the rulers just and temperate, the magistrates upright and incorruptible, the soldiers would scorn death, there would be neither vanity nor luxury. So far so good, but let us hear more. Christianity as a religion is entirely spiritual, occupied solely with heavenly things. The country of the Christian is not of this world. He does his duty indeed, but does it with profound indifference to the good or ill success of his care. Provided he has nothing to reproach himself with, it matters little to him whether things go well or ill here on earth. If the state is prosperous, he hardly dares to share in the public happiness, for fear he may grow proud of his country's glory. If the state is languishing, he blesses the hand of God that is hard upon his people. For the state to be peaceable and for harmony to be maintained, all the citizens without exception would have to be good Christians. If by ill hap there should be a single self-seeker or hypocrite, a Catiline or a Cromwell, for instance, he would certainly get the better of his pious compatriots. Christian charity does not readily allow a man to think hardly of his neighbors. As soon as, by some trick, he has discovered the art of imposing on them and getting hold of a share in the public authority, you have a man established in dignity. It is the will of God that he be respected. Very soon you have a power. It is God's will that it be obeyed. And if the power is abused by him who wields it, it is the scourge wherewith God punishes his children. There would be scruples about driving out the usurper. Public tranquility would have to be disturbed. Violence would have to be employed, and blood spilt. All this accords ill with Christian meekness. And after all, in this vale of sorrows, what does it matter whether we are free men or serfs? The essential thing is to get to heaven, and resignation is only an additional means of doing so. If war breaks out with another state, the citizens march readily out to battle. Not one of them thinks of flight. They do their duty, but they have no passion for victory. They know better how to die than how to conquer. What does it matter whether they win or lose? Does not Providence know better than they what is meet for them? Only think to what account a proud, impetuous and passionate enemy could turn their stoicism. Set over against them those generous peoples who were devoured by ardent love of glory and of their country. Imagine your Christian republic face to face with Sparta or Rome. The pious Christians will be beaten, crushed, and destroyed before they know where they are, or will owe their safety only to the contempt their enemy will conceive for them. It was to my mind a fine oath that was taken by the soldiers of Fabius, who swore not to conquer or die, but to come back victorious, and kept their oath. Christians would never have taken such an oath. They would have looked on it as tempting God. But I am mistaken in speaking of a Christian republic. The terms are mutually exclusive. Christianity preaches only servitude and dependence. Its spirit is so favorable to tyranny that it always profits by such a raging. True Christians are made to be slaves, and they know it and do not much mind. This short life counts for too little in their eye. I shall be told that Christian troops are excellent. I deny it. Show me an instance. For my part, I know of no Christian troops. I shall be told of the Crusades. Without disputing the valor of the Crusaders, I answer that, so far from being Christians, they were the priests' soldiery, citizens of the Church. They fought for their spiritual country, which the Church had, somehow or other, made temporal. Well understood, this goes back to paganism. As the gospel sets up no national religion, a holy war is impossible among Christians. Under the pagan emperors, the Christian soldiers were brave. Every Christian writer affirms it, and I believe it. It was a case of honorable emulation of the pagan troops. As soon as the emperors were Christian, this emulation no longer existed, and when the cross had driven out the eagle, Roman valor wholly disappeared. But setting aside political considerations, let us come back to what is right, and settle our principles on this important point. The right which the social compact gives the sovereign over the subjects does not, we have seen, exceed the limits of public expediency. The subjects, then, owe the sovereign an account of their opinions, only to such an extent as they matter to the community. Now, it matters very much to the community that each citizen should have a religion. That will make him love his duty, but the dogmas of that religion concern the state and its members only so far as they have reference to morality, and to the duties which he who professes them is bound to do to others. Each man may have, over and above, what opinions he pleases, without it being the sovereign's business to take cognizance of them. For, as the sovereign has no authority in the other world, whatever the lot of its subjects may be in the life to come, that is not its business, provided they are good citizens in this life. There is therefore a purely civil profession of faith of which the sovereign should fix the articles, not exactly as religious dogmas, but as social sentiments without which a man cannot be a good citizen or a faithful subject. While it can compel no one to believe them, it can banish from the state whoever does not believe them. It can banish him, not for impiety, but as an antisocial being, incapable of truly loving the laws and justice, and of sacrificing at need his life to his duty. If anyone, after publicly recognizing these dogmas, behaves as if he does not believe them, let him be punished by death. He has committed the worst of all crimes, that of lying before the law. The dogmas of civil religion ought to be few, simple, and exactly worded, without explanation or commentary. The existence of a mighty, intelligent, and beneficent divinity, possessed of foresight and providence, the life to come, the happiness of the just, the punishment of the wicked, the sanctity of the social contract and the laws, these are its positive dogmas. Its negative dogmas I confine to one, intolerance, which is a part of the cults we have rejected. Those who distinguish civil from theological intolerance are, to my mind, mistaken. The two forms are inseparable. It is impossible to live at peace with those we regard as damned. To love them would be to hate God who punishes them. We positively must either reclaim or torment. Wherever theological intolerance is admitted, it must inevitably have some civil effect, and as soon as it has such an effect, the sovereign is no longer sovereign even in the temporal sphere. Thenceforth priests are the real masters, and kings only their ministers. Now that there is and can be no longer an exclusive national religion, tolerance should be given to all religions that tolerate others, so long as their dogmas contain nothing contrary to the duties of citizenship. But whoever dares to say, outside the church is no salvation, ought to be driven from the state, unless the state is the church, and the prince the pontiff. Such a dogma is good only in a theocratic government. In any other, it is fatal. The reason for which Henry IV is said to have embraced the Roman religion ought to make every honest man leave it, and still more any prince who knows how to reason. Chapter IX Conclusion. Now that I have laid down the true principles of political right, and tried to give the state a basis of its own to rest on, I ought next to strengthen it by its external relations, which would include the law of nations, commerce, the right of war and conquest, public right, leagues, negotiations, treaties, etc. But all this forms a new subject that is far too vast for my narrow scope. I ought throughout to have kept to a more limited sphere.